Beneath the polished surfaces of modern maps lies a strange truth. Not everything that once existed is still acknowledged. Across continents and oceans, entire towns have vanished, borders have shifted, and islands have sunk without a trace. Some places were swallowed by water, others removed by force, or forgotten through quiet decisions. What was once familiar terrain became blank space edited out, reclassified, or erased altogether. These are not lost cities of legend, but real locations that existed within living memory. Their disappearance is not a mystery of mythology, but a quiet rearrangement of space, purpose, and power. Through satellite images, declassified documents, and archival maps, a different story emerges, one of presence and removal. Join us as we trace the contours of these erased places, revealing the ghost outlines that still linger just beneath the map's surface. What disappears from the page does not always vanish from the world. It simply waits. The vanishing of Agloe, New York. In 1937, a new town appeared on the map of New York State. It sat in a quiet, wooded region of the Catskill Mountains, located along a remote dirt road in Delaware County. Its name was Agloe. It had no mayor, no residents, no buildings, and no origin in land deeds or state records. Yet for decades, it remained on multiple maps, even appearing in certain gazetteers. What made Agloe unusual was not that it had vanished, it never truly existed in the first place. It was created not by settlers or planners, but by cartographers. The name Agloe was not derived from local geography, a founder's surname, or a Native American word. Instead, it was an acronym, a product of two names, Otto G. Lindbergh and Ernest Alpers. Lindbergh and Alpers worked for the General Drafting Company, a map-making firm that produced road maps for Texaco service stations. They were concerned about unauthorized copying. Inserting a fictional town was their way of catching competitors in the act of plagiarism. This was not an uncommon practice at the time. These fictional entries, often called trap streets or paper towns, were used by publishers to identify unauthorized reproductions of their work. A copied error was a clear indication that someone had replicated their map. Agloe was one such invention. Its coordinates were placed deliberately in a forested area with no settlements. If it ever appeared elsewhere, they would know why. And eventually, it did. In the 1952nd, a rival company, Rand McNally, published a map of New York State that included Agloe. When confronted, Rand McNally claimed it had not copied General Drafting's map. They argued that Agloe had been found through local sources, a general store operating under that name. The store, as it turned out, had taken the name from the map. The owners, unfamiliar with its fictional origin, had named their establishment Agloe General Store because they believed that was the name of the area. In this way, fiction turned into fact. What had started as an imaginary place on paper became a physical location with a sign and a commercial presence. The general store attracted some visitors and truckers, drawn by what they believed was a minor landmark. For a short while, the illusion reinforced itself. A name invented to catch copyright infringement became a functioning address. Agloe began to appear in other contexts. It was mentioned in legal documents and mailing lists. A few cabins were built nearby, using Agloe as a descriptive term. People started referring to that patch of the Catskills by the name, even if it had no governance, no official boundaries, and no services. It did not appear on the census, but it could be found on several commercial maps, and occasionally on state road atlases. It even appeared in some versions of the US Geological Survey's place name indexes, though usually with disclaimers. But the place remained fragile. The store closed in the 1972nd, and by the 1982nd, the handful of buildings near the supposed town centre had fallen into disuse. Without economic activity or permanent residence, Aglo began to dissolve. Newer map editions quietly removed it. The New York State Department of Transportation omitted it from updated materials. The US Board on Geographic Names never recognized it officially. By 1990, Aglo was gone from nearly every contemporary map. Its disappearance was not marked by any event. There was no demolition, no legal motion, no announcement. It was a quiet removal, a soft erasure. The absence of Aglo raised little concern because its existence had never been certain to begin with. But Aglo did not vanish entirely. Its story lingered in archives and occasional discussions among geographers. In the 2002, with the rise of digital maps and online databases, Aglo resurfaced in an unusual way. People using Google Maps noticed the name appearing once more. It was identified as a town with coordinates and nearby roads, even though no physical structures could be found. This caused renewed curiosity. Some researchers traced the location, finding only forest and open land. A few explorers visited the site and took photos of the empty space, posting them online. One visitor installed a homemade wooden sign, nailed to a tree, reading "Welcome to Aglo." Over time, others added their own small memorials, a laminated page with a printout of a vintage map, a Polaroid photo, a bottle cap nailed below the sign. Interest in Aglo peaked in 2008 when author John Green released a novel titled Paper Towns, in which the town plays a symbolic role. The novel was later adapted into a film in 2015, renewing popular awareness. Readers of the book, unfamiliar with the concept of fictional towns inserted into maps, were fascinated by the idea of a place that became real because people believed it was. Aglo began appearing in trivia games, geocaching challenges, and social media threads. Despite being removed from official documents, it now lived as a cultural reference. For some, it became a philosophical point evidence that belief and perception can shape reality, even if only temporarily. The case of Aglo is not unique in the history of mapmaking. Other paper towns have appeared, though most never became as well known. In Ohio, a fictional town named Beatosu was added to a 1,978 highway map by a cartographer named George R. Stewart. It was inserted near Toledo as a prank, alongside another non-existent town called Goblu, referencing a sports rivalry between the University of Michigan and Ohio State University. The names were eventually discovered and removed, but not before confusing travelers. In England, the name Argleton appeared on Google Maps in 2008. It was marked as a town in Lancashire, complete with coordinates and postal references. Yet it did not exist. Argleton was located in a field between real villages. Theories emerged. Was it a test point? A copyright trap? A software glitch? Google never provided a full explanation, and Argleton was removed in 2010. Another phantom feature was Mount Richard, which appeared on some Canadian maps in the 20th century. No such mountain exists. Survey teams sent to its supposed location found only flat land. Its presence was likely the result of a transcription error during data transfer, but it persisted on several maps for years before being quietly corrected. These examples show how easily the perceived truth of geography can be manipulated. Maps are often treated as objective records, but they are constructed by people. Mistakes, fabrications, and assumptions are part of their history. Sometimes these elements remain unnoticed for years. Other times they take on a life of their own. When Aglo faded from maps, it became an absence that carried meaning. Travelers reported searching for it, only to find trees and silence. Locals nearby often had no idea the name had ever existed. But occasionally, someone would recall the store or the odd tourists who stopped and asked where the town was. Today, Aglo has no government, no signs recognized by the state, and no residents who claim it as home. But it continues to exist on certain digital mapping platforms, often labeled as a fictional place or a historic curiosity. It has a Wikipedia entry. It has been used in university lectures and cartography workshops as an example of map-based fiction becoming fact. No boundary separates real from imagined on a map. A name is printed, it appears in directories, a person visits, a structure is built. For a short while, a lie becomes a place. Then the place dissolves. The name remains in memories, data, and stories, long after its location has returned to forest. Aglo is gone, but people still search for it. The disappearance of Witch Farm Village. In the county of Dorset on England's southern coast, not far from the edge of Poole Harbour, there once appeared on older maps a place known as Witch Farm Village. For some, it was just another hamlet among the many that dotted the landscape of rural Britain. But over time, the village's presence on maps became uncertain. Its name stopped appearing in updated records. Roads that once led to it were absorbed by private property. And by the late 20th century, Witch Farm Village had disappeared from most official cartography altogether. What replaced it was not another town, but something very different, an industrial facility quietly hidden in one of the most environmentally protected areas in the United Kingdom. Witch Farm Village was not large, it was never a major settlement, but it had a name, some cottages, and a road connecting it to nearby Corfe Castle and Studland. As early as the 19th century, maps published by the Ordnance Survey, the official mapping agency of Great Britain, show the presence of Witch Farm. The term farm may suggest a single agricultural holding, but local directories from the 1922nd and 1932nd make references to Witch Farm as a small village area with multiple structures and workers. It sat near the boundary of Rempstone Forest, in a low-lying area surrounded by heath and marshland. The name Witch has long been part of the area's geography. Witch Lake, Witch Heath, and Witch Farm are all documented names stretching back several centuries. The exact origin of the term remains unclear, though some sources suggest it derives from an Old English root word related to salt, possibly from nearby brine springs. The area was always sparsely populated, difficult to reach, and prone to flooding, but it remained marked as inhabited through the mid-20th century. Then, in 1973, oil was discovered underneath Witch Farm. It came as a surprise. The region was not known for hydrocarbon resources, and the landscape was part of the Dorset Area of Outstanding Natural Beauty, a designation meant to preserve it from large-scale development. But the oil reserves, buried in sandstone layers more than 1,500 metres deep, were significant. British Petroleum, BP, obtained licences to drill and began establishing infrastructure quietly. Because of environmental sensitivity, the facility was built with a unique goal: to make it as invisible as possible. BP constructed underground pipelines stretching several kilometres, connecting extraction sites to distant terminals. Processing facilities were buried or concealed within wooded enclosures. Overhead, electrical lines were avoided. From above, the area retained the appearance of countryside. There were no gas flares, no towering stacks, and no visible derricks. Visitors to the Purbeck Hills or the beaches of Studland would pass nearby, unaware that one of Western Europe's largest onshore oil fields operated beneath their feet. As the oil field expanded, the physical footprint of Witch Farm Village began to contract. Buildings were bought out, old farm roads were gated or rerouted, signs bearing the village's name were removed. Public access became limited. A small network of cottages that had once been part of the village was either demolished or incorporated into the security perimeter of the facility. The village's name slowly stopped appearing on updated Ordnance Survey maps. By the 1992nd, most official maps no longer showed Witch Farm Village as a settlement. The name persisted only as a reference to the oil field. Witch Farm became synonymous with the industrial site rather than the community. The surrounding roads, such as Soldiers Road and Corfe Road, remained, but the smaller lanes that once led directly into the village area were either reclassified or made inaccessible to the public. What had once been a minor rural village was now a concealed industrial operation with no local population and no formal boundaries. Local councils made few public statements about the change. Planning permissions were granted under environmental mitigation terms. Documents refer to visual masking, acoustic shielding, and ecological restoration zones. The transformation of the village into an oil production site was not framed as erasure, but as necessary modernization. Yet for those who remembered the village, the disappearance was noticeable. In 1998, Perenco, a French energy firm, took over operations of Witch Farm from BP. The facility continued operating with minimal visual disturbance. Helicopter surveys showed tree cover, green fencing, and camouflaged buildings. Some infrastructure was built below ground. Oil was extracted at a rate of around 15,000 barrels per day, pumped through pipelines to terminals in Poole and Southampton. All of it was done under strict environmental controls. The oil field sat near rare heathland habitats, bird sanctuaries, and protected forest. But the village itself was no longer visible. Today, the name Witch Farm Village appears mostly in historical references. Early 20th century census data contains records of births and deaths. War memorials in nearby villages list individuals from Witch Farm who served in both world wars. But on modern maps, it is absent. Visitors to the area can walk along permitted paths in the Purbeck Hills or paddle in the calm waters of Studland Bay, unaware that the village ever existed. The case of Witch Farm is not one of fiction or mistake. The village was real. It was not invented to catch plagiarists or to fill space, but its removal was quiet, gradual, and largely undocumented. It was not erased with fanfare or ceremony, but through planning permissions, industrial development, and the absence of need for its name to remain. Similar erasures have occurred elsewhere, often in relation to industrial or military activity. In the United States, several towns in Pennsylvania and Ohio vanished from maps after being absorbed by coal mining operations. In Russia, entire villages were removed from official records during Soviet-era environmental re-engineering projects. In each case, a place disappeared, not because it never existed, but because its existence became inconvenient. Witch Farm's vanishing holds a different character. It was not a casualty of aggressive industry or sudden disaster. It was replaced by a facility designed to hide itself. No smoke, no noise. No skyline disruption. The oil was extracted beneath layers of concealment, and the name of the village faded along with its roads and cottages. Even locals in the surrounding area sometimes mistake the term Witch Farm to mean only the oil field. The idea that it was once a small village is mostly preserved in older directories and archival maps stored in county libraries. A few long-term residents of Corfe Castle and Wareham still remember the name being used in everyday conversation. One 1962 photo held in a regional archive shows a wooden sign with the words, "Witch Farm. Visitors please report to main cottage." That sign is long gone. Today, satellite imagery shows a patchwork of green fields, dirt tracks, and clusters of equipment partially hidden by tree lines. There are no clear borders. The oil field remains active but muted. It is one of the only major hydrocarbon sites in Britain operating under an invisibility agreement with conservation authorities. As for Witch Farm Village, it remains absent, not destroyed, but bypassed, overwritten, and unnamed. Maps continue to change. Places once known by name are absorbed, revised, or forgotten. What happened at Witch Farm is not an isolated case, but it is one of the clearest examples of how a real village, with homes and history, can vanish not through force, but through silence. The hidden zone of Zizek, California. In the arid Mojave Desert of southeastern California, nestled at the end of a cracked access road between Baker and Barstow, there is a place that almost seems invented. Its name is Zizek. The spelling was chosen to be the last word in the English language. But what lies beyond the strange name is a forgotten chapter of American land use, a desert compound that was erased from maps, transferred in silence, and eventually reclassified with no clear explanation. What remains is a place that exists but is often overlooked, even by the systems that once recorded it. Zizek is located off Interstate 15, near Soda Dry Lake. The region is part of the Mojave National Preserve, a protected landscape of salt flats, volcanic cinder cones, and sun-bleached brush. The land itself is harsh and largely undeveloped, with temperatures regularly exceeding 110 degrees Fahrenheit in summer. Yet in the 1942nd, this remote area became the center of a curious experiment in health, religion, and self-promotion. The man behind it was Curtis Howe Springer, a self-declared doctor, preacher, and radio personality. Springer was not a licensed medical professional, though he often claimed to be. He had no formal theological training, yet he managed to convince thousands of radio listeners across the United States to follow his teachings, donate to his cause, and purchase his proprietary health tonics. In 1944, he set his sights on Soda Springs, a forgotten railroad watering stop on government land. Springer filed a mining claim on the site, not to extract minerals, but to circumvent homesteading laws. He built a spa compound complete with dormitories, a dining hall, a chapel, and an artificial lake. He named it Zizek Mineral Springs and Health Resort, branding it the last word in health. Visitors arrived from across the country seeking cures for ailments through mineral water, sunlight, and spiritual lectures. Some stayed for weeks, others never left. For nearly 30 years, Zizek operated in a legal grey zone. It was built on federal land without a proper lease, but enforcement was lax. Springer used his radio platform to promote the location, claiming miraculous properties for the desert air and spring water. He printed pamphlets. He named himself the Dean of the Zizek Bible College. Though the facility lacked accreditation, it distributed diplomas. The complex was built using scavenged materials. Old railroad ties, concrete slabs, and sheet metal formed the buildings. A cross-shaped pool was dug by hand. Palm trees were planted beside the lake. Paths were lined with stones painted white. From above, the layout resembled a carefully arranged retreat, but maps during this time often excluded the site. U.S. Geological Survey documents from the 1952nd show blank space in the area surrounding Soda Dry Lake. Road atlases of the era label the nearby terrain, but omit Zizek. This omission was not accidental. Zizek was not considered an official settlement. It had no postal code, no municipal governance, and no population recognized by the census. Though hundreds passed through each year, they left little data. Springer maintained control of the site through charismatic authority, not bureaucracy. Federal agencies allowed the activity to continue, but did not document it in public planning records. In 1974, the situation changed. The Bureau of Land Management, BLM, conducted a review of improper land use across federal holdings in California. Zizek was identified as a violation. The compound was raided by U.S. Marshals. Springer and his followers were evicted. Charges were filed, not for fraud or medical malpractice, but for unauthorized occupation of government land. Springer was fined and banned from returning. He died in 1985, having spent his final years quietly in Las Vegas. After his removal, the site fell into disrepair. The artificial lake dried out. Buildings collapsed under the weight of desert heat and wind. No plans were made to restore or repurpose the location. For several years, Zizeks vanished again from public view. The road was gated. Maps labelled the area only as Soda Springs or left it unmarked. Its strange name, briefly known through radio and word of mouth, returned to silence. Then, in 1976, California State University obtained permission to reuse the land. The Desert Studies Center was established on the grounds of the former resort. Scientists and students arrived to conduct research on desert ecology, climate, and geology. Some of the old structures were repaired and converted into classrooms or labs. Others were left untouched, crumbling reminders of a removed era. Yet the new presence did not restore Zizeks to full visibility. Despite the academic use, maps continued to treat the site with caution. Most highway signs pointed only to Zizeks Road, not the location itself. GPS systems frequently mislabel the site, assigning its coordinates to nearby elevations or unmarked points. Federal land surveys acknowledge the research station, but rarely mention the original compound. The U.S. Postal Service has never issued a zip code for Zizeks. Travelers passing along I-15 often see the road sign and assume it is a joke or misprint. Some turn off out of curiosity, only to find a long, cracked road that leads to a cluster of low buildings and a fenced perimeter. The structures are real, but the name carries no administrative status. Zizeks is not a town, not a landmark, and not a legal address. It exists physically, but not bureaucratically. Even within the Mojave National Preserve's official documentation, the site is referenced cautiously. Some documents refer to it only as the Research Center near Soda Lake. Others use the term former Zizeks compound. The ambiguity remains deliberate. The history of Springer's occupation complicates its status. So does the fact that the land was never transferred in full. It remains under federal ownership, with restricted use permissions. This layered identity, part religious commune, part unrecognized settlement, part university outpost, has kept Zizeks in a liminal state. It is a place people live temporarily, but not permanently. It has students and visiting scholars, but no registered residents. It has facilities, but no local government. It has history, but no official acknowledgement on the map. Even as satellite imagery reveals its outlines, most databases list the area as undeveloped land. There have been occasional efforts to formalize its status. Proposals have surfaced to designate the original site as a cultural landmark or historical zone. Others suggest removing the name entirely, restoring the land to desert conditions and memory. For now, neither approach has succeeded. The site continues quietly as a research station. Its name remains unusual, and its presence remains uncertain. Those who visit often report a feeling of disconnection. The silence of the dry lake, the fading outlines of old religious texts painted on the walls, the empty chapel with no congregation. It is a place between definitions, preserved but not publicized. Photographs of Zizeks rarely appear in official brochures. It remains a curiosity, a footnote, a strange word at the end of the dictionary, and a place that almost never made it onto the map. There are no monuments to Zizeks' past, no bronze plaques, no guided tours. The few remaining structures stand without interpretation. Visitors who do find the place often leave with more questions than answers. Was it a town, a scam, a sanctuary, a research site, or something that lies outside all those categories? The answer, like the place itself, resists clarity. The submerged city of Port Royal, Jamaica. In the 17th century, Port Royal was one of the most prominent cities in the Caribbean. Located at the end of the Palisadoes sand spit in Kingston Harbour, Jamaica, it served as a major hub for trade, privateering, and maritime traffic. By 1692, it had grown into what some referred to as the richest and wickedest city in the New World. It had narrow streets, densely packed buildings, and a population that included merchants, sailors, pirates, and clergy. Then, in less than 2 minutes, most of it vanished. On the 7th of June, 1692, at 11:43 the morning, a massive earthquake struck the region. Geological surveys later identified the cause as movement along a fault that had been building tension beneath the island for decades. The shaking was intense, but the true devastation came not from the tremor itself, but from the soil beneath Port Royal. Much of the city was built on unconsolidated sand. When the quake struck, the ground liquefied. Entire buildings were swallowed, streets cracked open, stone structures slid into the sea, waves surged over the remains. Eyewitness accounts describe people vanishing into the earth. Churches collapsed during services. In some areas, the ground moved like water. A third of the city sank instantly beneath the harbour. Another third was destroyed beyond repair. The remainder was so unstable that survivors had to abandon it. In total, over 2,000 people died, about half the city's population. Disease followed, spreading among the injured and displaced. The event marked the effective end of Port Royal as a functional city. The British colonial authorities debated rebuilding, but the site was deemed geologically unsafe. What remained above water was prone to further collapse. Hurricanes in the decades that followed worsened the damage. Eventually, the colonial capital was moved inland to Spanish Town and later to Kingston. Port Royal was relegated to a minor naval outpost. Its status on maps began to change. In early British nautical charts from the 18th century, Port Royal is still labelled, but with smaller type and fewer structural details. The elaborate street layout shown in earlier documents disappears. By the mid-19th century, many maps omit the area entirely as a residential settlement. Only the Royal Navy's station is marked, along with the nearby fort. Civilian infrastructure is no longer represented. Land use records from this period show declining population figures. The name Port Royal continues to appear, but as a place of reference, not a populated town. In the 20th century, archaeological interest in the site grew. Divers exploring Kingston Harbour discovered submerged streets, foundations, and entire sections of the city preserved under layers of silt and seawater. The preservation was remarkable. Due to the rapid nature of the submersion and the low oxygen environment underwater, wooden beams, pottery, and even clothing were found intact. Scholars began calling it the Pompeii of the New World. Yet, even as underwater exploration confirmed the city's former presence, it remained largely absent from everyday maps. Tourist maps of Jamaica marked the area as Port Royal Fort or Naval Dockyard. Some included a small anchor symbol to indicate maritime ruins. Few, if any, showed the full extent of the former city. Satellite imagery from government agencies identified the area as Palisadoes, often without specific references to the sunken urban grid. The city that once rivaled Havana and Cartagena in scale had become invisible to casual viewers. Port Royal was not deliberately erased. There was no coordinated effort to remove it from historical record. But its absence from modern cartography reflects a broader uncertainty about how to represent places that no longer function. It is not abandoned in the usual sense. People still live nearby. Fishing boats launch from its shores. The Jamaican Coast Guard operates a base from the point. But the city itself, the Port Royal that existed in 1692, remains underwater, ungoverned, and unmapped. Attempts to reclaim or rebuild parts of the area have faced numerous setbacks. A plan in the 1992 to develop a cruise terminal at Port Royal was delayed for decades. Environmental regulations, preservation concerns, and unstable geology have stalled most proposals. In 2020, Jamaica's government revived interest in a controlled tourist landing site, but actual restoration of the submerged ruins was deemed infeasible. Any large-scale development risked disturbing the archaeological integrity of the site. Researchers have mapped the underwater remains in great detail. Sonar scans show cobbled streets leading to submerged house foundations. Pewter cups, ink bottles, and clay pipes remain where they fell. One diver reported seeing a staircase that ended in nothing but seawater. In some places, the tops of doorways still stand upright in the sand, but these detailed maps are used by marine archaeologists. They do not appear in general atlases or satellite overlays. The submerged city remains off-grid. The transformation of Port Royal from a mapped capital to a missing city reveals how time, disaster, and shifting priorities affect how places are recorded. Maps are not simply reflections of terrain. They are decisions about what is relevant. When a city no longer serves commerce, governance, or residence, it can be moved aside not by force, but by omission. Old maps from the 1682nd show Port Royal as a dense knot of streets, labelled with names like Lime Street, Church Street, and Queen's Lane. These names no longer appear. In modern digital maps, a search for Port Royal yields a coastal edge with a few labelled buildings. There are no streets listed inland, no sign of the grid, no historical layering. To see the lost city, one must search archaeological papers or sonar reconstructions. In everyday navigation tools, it is a void. Even in official records, the question of how to classify Port Royal remains unresolved. It is not an active city, it is not uninhabited, it is not fully preserved. For years, UNESCO has considered parts of the site for World Heritage status, but designation remains pending. Meanwhile, local residents live in a separate present. They occupy the edge of a history that is mostly hidden beneath the water. Occasionally, tremors shake the harbour again. The geological fault responsible for the 1692 event remains active. Experts have warned that further quakes could destabilise submerged structures. Tourists walk the breakwater and look out across the sea, unaware that beneath the calm surface lies a city that once rivaled any port in the Caribbean. Some dive, most do not. The bell of St. Paul's Church, which once stood at the centre of Port Royal, now lies buried under silt and seawater. Ships dock near its old location. No marker tells visitors what happened. On land, a few signs near the fort mention the quake. They summarise the event in brief, but the full map of Port Royal, with its streets and homes and marketplaces, is not reproduced. It remains sunken in salt water, in sediment, and in the spaces between maps. The disappearing borders of Bir Tawil. Between the countries of Egypt and Sudan lies a stretch of desert that is claimed by neither nation. This territory, known as Bir Tawil, covers approximately 2,060 square kilometres and is one of the only places on Earth where a land border is defined not by contention but by complete disinterest. It has no cities, no permanent residents, and no natural resources of immediate value. Yet it exists on every map, often marked, then immediately ignored. It is real, but remains unclaimed. A place that cartographers cannot erase, but that governments do not want. The origins of Bir Tawil's strange status trace back to the colonial era. In 1899, the Anglo-Egyptian Condominium Agreement was signed, defining the boundary between Egypt and Sudan along the 22nd parallel north. This straight line was drawn by British administrators and formed the official border for legal and diplomatic purposes. However, 3 years later, in 1902, British authorities created a different administrative boundary to better reflect the way local tribes lived and moved. The 1902 boundary gave Sudan control of the Halaib Triangle, a coastal region north of the 22nd parallel, because it was primarily used by Sudanese tribes. In exchange, Bir Tawil, a dry inland region south of the parallel, was placed under Egyptian administration since it was used by tribes connected to Aswan. These two boundaries, legal and administrative, have been in conflict ever since. When Sudan gained independence in 1956, both countries began to assert sovereignty. Egypt claims the original 1899 border, which places Bir Tawil inside Sudan. Sudan, in contrast, claims the 1902 administrative boundary, which places Bir Tawil inside Egypt. Both claims are structured in such a way that each nation is trying to claim the Halaib Triangle, an area of greater economic and strategic value, while avoiding responsibility for Bir Tawil. This means that Bir Tawil is left in a unique condition. It is land that no nation officially claims. It is not disputed. It is unwanted. Because no country claims Bir Tawil, it has become one of the rare examples of terra nullius, a Latin term meaning land belonging to no one. While the term was once used to justify colonial expansion, in the case of Bir Tawil, it applies in the literal sense. It is a place where national boundaries contradict one another, creating a gap in the system of modern nation-states. Maps show Bir Tawil as an irregular quadrilateral south of the Halaib Triangle. Most cartographic representations include it, but often with faint lines, ambiguous labels, or footnotes. Satellite maps outline its shape but provide no further details. Some maps remove its name entirely, leaving only the desert itself. International atlases rarely include population or economic data for the area, because none exists. There are no roads in Bir Tawil, no airstrips, no electricity, no wells. The terrain consists of rocky hills and sand. The most prominent geographic feature is Gabal Hagar el Zarqa, a small mountain rising about 662 meters above sea level. Occasional camel tracks cross the area, but few travelers pass through. Temperatures in summer exceed 45 degrees Celsius. Rain is rare. The environment discourages habitation. Despite its isolation, Bir Tawil has drawn attention from time to time. In 2014, an American man named Jeremiah Heaton travelled there and planted a flag. He declared it the Kingdom of North Sudan in an attempt to fulfill a promise to his daughter that she could become a princess. The gesture was symbolic, lacking legal basis, but it briefly attracted international media. Heaton submitted claims to the United Nations, but received no recognition. The act demonstrated the appeal of unclaimed land in a world where nearly all territory is spoken for. Other individuals have made similar symbolic claims. Flags have been planted. Declarations posted online. Some describe Bir Tawil as the only free land left on Earth. Yet none of these efforts have legal recognition. The Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties and other international agreements prevent private individuals from establishing countries on land that lies between established borders. Bir Tawil remains untouched, not because it is free, but because it is entangled in overlapping disinterest. Efforts to explore or map Bir Tawil have been limited. Occasional satellite passes provide updated topography. Some scientific teams have conducted field surveys in adjacent regions, but rarely venture into the heart of Bir Tawil. Most data about the area is extrapolated from broader geological studies of the Eastern Desert. There is no census data, no postal service, no documented permanent settlement in modern history. In older maps from the 1962nd and 1972nd, Bir Tawil is often shown as a simple blank space. Some editions print its name in small, italicized font, indicating a lack of certainty. A few maps omit the region entirely, letting the boundary lines of Egypt and Sudan simply fail to meet. The area becomes an invisible triangle, hidden in a cartographic blind spot. These omissions are not mistakes. They reflect a larger question: how do you draw something that no one wants to claim? Bir towel is used occasionally by nomadic groups, particularly members of the Ababda and Bisharin tribes, who pass through during seasonal movements. However, these are temporary crossings. No tribe maintains permanent infrastructure there. In legal terms, their passage does not constitute occupation. The land remains unregistered, unmanaged, and unacknowledged by either state. In the digital age, Bir towel's anonymity persists. GPS systems mark its coordinates but do not route through it. Digital navigation tools provide no driving directions. Internet maps often treat it as a minor feature of the desert, without landmarks or services. Some online platforms list it only as a curiosity. It is catalogued, but not integrated. Egypt and Sudan continue to maintain competing claims over the Halaib Triangle, a region rich in coastline and minerals. That disagreement keeps Bir towel in its liminal state. To claim Bir towel would mean abandoning the larger claim. Neither government is willing to make that trade. In diplomacy, Bir towel is a pawn left off the board. From above, Bir towel looks like countless other stretches of desert windswept, sun-bleached, and without distinguishing marks. But on the map, it is an anomaly. A gap in the fabric of international borders. A reminder that the world, even in its most administratively defined form, still contains spaces that slip between definitions. No border posts mark its edges. No sign declares entry. No barrier prevents passage. It exists not by presence, but by absence held in place by mutual refusal. The Lost Island of Bermeja. Off the northern coast of Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula, in the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico, old maritime charts once showed a small island called Bermeja. It appeared on numerous Spanish maps dating back to the 16th century. Its coordinates were marked, its dimensions were recorded. It was sometimes described as reddish in colour, flat, and visible from ships sailing near the Campeche bank. For centuries, it was accepted as real. But by the early 2002, when government surveyors and researchers set out to locate it again, there was nothing there. The island had disappeared. Bermeja's recorded location placed it at approximately 22 degrees 33 minutes north and 91 degrees 22 minutes west. That would place it over 100 kilometers off the coast of Mexico, within a strategically important area of the Gulf. It was said to measure about 80 hectares. It had no trees, no fresh water, and no history of settlement. Still, its presence on maps for hundreds of years gave it importance. It was considered Mexican territory, and for a long time, that status went unchallenged until the geopolitical significance of the surrounding waters brought Bermeja back into question. The late 1992nd and early 2002 saw increased interest in deep-water oil reserves in the Gulf of Mexico. The region contains numerous oil-rich formations, and maritime boundaries are key to determining which nation has the rights to extract resources from a given area. The zone surrounding Bermeja fell within what became known as the Donut Hole, a portion of the Gulf not clearly under US or Mexican jurisdiction. If Bermeja existed, it would extend Mexico's exclusive economic zone, EEZ, by hundreds of kilometers, potentially giving it claim over lucrative offshore deposits. In 2008, Mexican senators and energy officials ordered a formal verification expedition. Government vessels, geographers, and maritime researchers were dispatched to Bermeja's recorded coordinates. They scanned the area using sonar and satellite positioning systems. They found only open sea, no island, no reef, no shoal, no geological elevation. The seabed was consistent and featureless. The disappearance of a mapped island raised immediate questions. Had it ever existed? Was it removed deliberately? Could it have sunk due to rising sea levels or natural subsidence? Or had Bermeja been a cartographic error from the beginning, an illusion copied from one chart to the next, never verified on the ground? Historical records suggest otherwise. Bermeja appears on maps as early as 1535. It is shown in the Hydrographic Office of the Spanish Navy in the 18th century. It continues to be listed in 19th century British naval charts. Mexican nautical guides published in the 1942nd and 1952nd refer to Bermeja without hesitation. In some cases, its existence is even mentioned in maritime training materials. That suggests consistency across time and institutions. Errors on maps do occur, but rarely with such longevity and repetition. Despite this, Bermeja does not appear in modern satellite imagery. American reconnaissance surveys, Mexican naval scans, and international maritime databases show no elevation or mass at the listed coordinates. In 2009, a formal report issued by Mexico's National Autonomous University, UNAM, concluded that Bermeja did not exist. The island had either never been there or had since vanished. The report included bathymetric data showing that the ocean floor at the reported site was 1,800 meters deep. The depth of the sea floor ruled out the possibility of simple erosion. Islands do erode over time, especially in hurricane-prone areas, but they leave some form of submerged trace, a reef, a bank, a rise in the seabed. No such feature was found, nor was there evidence of tectonic activity or seismic subsidence in that precise region. Bermeja, it appeared, had not sunken. It had simply ceased to be. Speculation followed. Some suggested Bermeja might have been destroyed on purpose. The theory held that if the island's existence gave Mexico an extended maritime boundary, and if that extension impeded oil negotiations with the United States, then its removal, physically or cartographically, would serve certain interests. The theory gained traction in some political circles and media reports. A few Mexican lawmakers accused foreign powers of destroying the island to limit Mexico's claim to offshore reserves. However, there is no evidence to support intentional destruction. Removing an island would require large-scale underwater demolition. It would involve physical alterations to the seafloor that would likely be detectable. No such evidence has surfaced. The ocean floor remains undisturbed. Others propose that Bermeja been a misidentified phantom island, a result of mirage, optical illusion, or navigational error. In the 18th and 19th centuries, sailors relied on visual sightings and magnetic bearings. It is possible that a passing sargassum patch or a low-lying cloud bank was mistaken for land. Once reported, the island was repeated across maps, accepted as fact, and never closely verified. But this explanation remains speculative. The consistency of Bermeja's recorded position argues against a one-time mistake. Regardless of its cause, the disappearance of Bermeja had consequences. Without the island, Mexico's maritime claim to parts of the donut hole was weakened. In 2000, the United States and Mexico signed a treaty dividing the Gulf's disputed area. Critics of the agreement argued that it conceded potential oil fields to US control. Had Bermeja existed, the boundary line might have shifted further north, placing more of the seabed within Mexico's exclusive economic zone. In 2010, renewed calls were made for an independent survey. The Mexican Navy dispatched another team to the coordinates using updated sonar and satellite systems. They again found no trace of land. In response, Some politicians called for declassification of historical cartographic records, including military archives and foreign survey data. If Bemaya had once existed, they argued, its removal or loss should have left a trail in maps, in correspondence, or in oceanographic data logs. But no trail has been found. The name Bemaya lingers only in historical references. It no longer appears in official nautical charts. Google Maps and other digital platforms do not show it. Maritime GPS systems skip over the coordinates. The island, once useful, is now absent. In Mexico, Bemaya remains a symbol of uncertainty. For some, it represents a failure of national sovereignty land that was once theirs, now erased. For others, it is an example of how fragile geographic knowledge can be. The idea that an island could exist for centuries on paper and then vanish in the age of satellites unsettles the sense of certainty that modern mapping depends on. Phantom islands are not unheard of. The 19th century saw many such anomalies. Corrected Isla de San Juan, near the Galapagos, Emerald Island in the South Pacific, and the fabled island of Bus. All were charted, then removed. But Bemaya's case stands out due to its legal implications. It was not just a cartographic mystery, it was a border. Today, Bemaya is taught in Mexican law schools, often in classes on maritime sovereignty. It is referenced in energy policy discussions. It appears in conspiracy forums and documentaries. Some claim it sank due to environmental degradation. Others suggest it never existed at all. The truth remains undocumented. On modern navigational screens, the site of Bemaya is just open sea. No markers, no labels. Ships cross the area, unaware that they are sailing through a place that once had coordinates, dimensions, and a name. The island is not missing. It has been removed. Cartographers now face a peculiar challenge. When an island is removed, do maps acknowledge that absence, or do they erase it completely? Most choose the latter. On official Mexican hydrographic maps published after 2010, the space where Bemaya once was is simply water. No dotted lines, no footnotes, no memorial. In this way, Bemaya has joined the quiet category of places that are no longer recorded, not lost in war, not destroyed by nature, but eliminated through the soft edits of modern cartography. Its presence lasted centuries. Its absence now feels permanent. Bemaya is not visited. It has no monument, no digital simulation. Its name survives only in legal archives, old map scans, and scattered headlines from the early 2000s. For most, it was never seen. For some, it remains a question with no clear answer. But on paper, it was there. And then, without waves or wind, it was not. The erased town of Times Beach, Missouri. 27 miles southwest of St. Louis, nestled along the Merrimack River, there once stood a quiet Midwestern town named Times Beach. Founded in 1925 as a summer resort for working-class families, it was initially developed by the St. Louis Times newspaper as part of a promotional campaign. Readers could purchase 6-month subscriptions and, in return, receive a small lot of land in the new community. The idea was simple: to create an affordable getaway for city dwellers, offering a chance to build cabins near the water. But within 60 years, Times Beach would be wiped from the map not by fire or flood, but by an invisible chemical that seeped into the soil, saturating its streets and playgrounds, and turning a town into a federal warning sign. By the 1952nd, many summer homes had been converted into permanent residences. Times Beach had around 1,200 people, a town hall, a post office, churches, and small businesses. The roads were unpaved, and in the summer months, thick dust would rise as cars passed by. This dust, fine and persistent, irritated lungs and settled on everything. Residents began looking for a solution. In the early 1972, the city contracted a local waste oil hauler named Russell Bliss to spray the roads with used oil to control the dust. It seemed effective. The oil darkened the gravel streets and kept the particles down. Few questioned what was in the liquid. What the residents didn't know was that the waste oil used by Bliss was contaminated with dioxin, one of the most toxic chemical compounds known. It had originated from waste produced by a company attempting to manufacture hexachlorophene, a once popular antibacterial agent. During its production, a byproduct known as 2,3,7,8 P-dioxin formed a compound associated with birth defects, cancer, and immune disorders. The chemical waste was sold cheaply, and Bliss, unaware or indifferent to its properties, mixed it with used motor oil and sprayed it across roads, horse arenas, and parking lots. Between 1972 and 1976, this contaminated oil was sprayed on over 160,000 gallons of surface in Times Beach and surrounding areas. By the late 1972, strange illnesses began appearing in animals and people. Horses in nearby farms developed mysterious sores. Chickens died. Children experienced skin rashes, nausea, and fatigue. Investigations started slowly, but eventually federal environmental agencies began to suspect contamination. In 1982, the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, began sampling soil in Times Beach. The results were alarming. Dioxin concentrations in some areas were several hundred times the level considered safe. Before the residents could fully absorb the implications, disaster struck again. In December 1982, the Merrimack River flooded, submerging large parts of the town. The flood not only destroyed homes, but spread the contaminated soil, dispersing it across the town's surface in ways that could no longer be measured precisely. Shortly after the floodwaters receded, the EPA and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention recommended that the town be permanently evacuated. In 1983, under growing public concern and media attention, the federal government announced it would buy out all 800 residential properties in Times Beach. The decision marked one of the largest environmental relocation efforts in US history. Over the next 3 years, families were forced to leave. Some received compensation, others fought legal battles. In the end, nearly all structures were demolished. The town was officially disincorporated in 1985. Postal service ceased. Telephone numbers were disconnected. Road signs were taken down. Public maps revised their legends. Some replaced the label Times Beach with white space. Others marked it only as former site of Times Beach. Over time, even that faded. By the 1992, most road atlases omitted it entirely. Cleanup of the site began in the late 1982. A high-temperature incinerator was built near the town's edge, where contaminated soil from Times Beach and over 24 other Missouri sites was trucked in and burned. The incineration process lasted until 1997 and destroyed over 265,000 tons of soil. The project cost more than $200 million. Once complete, the EPA declared the area remediated. In 1999, the site was repurposed as Route 66 State Park. Walking trails, interpretive signs, and a visitor center were installed. Trees were planted, grass grew over the empty foundations. Today, visitors to the park can walk along paths that once lined residential streets. The visitor center itself is housed in a former roadhouse building located just outside the town's original boundary. Inside, displays explain the history of the area, including photos of homes, churches, and a school that once stood nearby. but the park's name makes no reference to Times Beach. Its history is there, but not obvious. In GPS systems, the name Times Beach yields limited results. It sometimes redirects to Eureka, the nearest incorporated town. Satellite images show trees, meadows, and walking paths, but no buildings, no grid of streets, no trace of the former City Hall or the Baptist Church remains. Occasionally, old maps surface online or in antique stores, showing Times Beach marked in faint ink, sitting quietly beside the Merrimack River. They are now historical artifacts, representing a place removed by contamination and bureaucratic necessity. The erasure of Times Beach was not a sudden event. It was gradual, conducted through policy, demolition, and the slow redrawing of maps. There was no ceremony, no official day of removal. It simply became inconvenient to include a town that no longer existed. School records were transferred, medical charts were relocated, voter rolls dissolved, the cartographic community followed suit. Publishers stopped labeling the location. Digital databases revised their coordinates. Today, some former residents still gather for reunions. They meet in nearby communities and speak of the town in the past tense. Their children visit the park, sometimes unaware that the trails trace what were once sidewalks and driveways. A few of the original street lamps were preserved and now stand in the museum. But most physical signs of the town are gone. No marker on the highway tells drivers that a city once existed beyond the trees. Travelers pass the park exit, unaware they are within feet of where 2,000 people once lived. The town has not been forgotten by those who lived there, but it has been deliberately uncatalogued. Times Beach represents one of the clearest examples of a place removed due to environmental catastrophe. Unlike ghost towns abandoned for economic reasons, or villages erased by war, it was taken apart scientifically, legally, and then cartographically. The land was cleansed, the buildings removed, the name retired. In many databases today, Times Beach is a dead entry, a blank in postal systems, a null reference in demographic charts. But beneath the trees of Route 66 State Park, the soil still remembers. And the map, though edited, once held its name. The forgotten town of Centralia, Pennsylvania. Beneath the cracked streets of Centralia, Pennsylvania, a fire has been burning since 1962. It started in the borough's landfill, an abandoned strip mine that was being used as a public dump. When local authorities set it ablaze to clean up refuse before the Memorial Day holiday, the flames ignited a vein of anthracite coal beneath the surface. The fire spread quickly through the tunnels of a vast interlinked mining system that ran under the town. Attempts to extinguish it failed. It reached deeper seams, branching outward underground. Within years, Centralia became uninhabitable. The town was located in Columbia County, part of Pennsylvania's coal region. At its peak, it had more than 1,000 residents. It was a working-class community with churches, general stores, schools, and a post office. Maps of the 1,952nd show a clear street grid. Locust Avenue ran east to west, cutting across Railroad Street and Park Street. There were rows of houses and public buildings marked clearly in state planning maps. But once the fire took hold, conditions began to change. By the 1,972nd, signs of the underground fire appeared above ground. Smoke rose from the soil. Cracks opened in streets. Residents noticed dead vegetation, strange smells, and occasional heat radiating from basements. Carbon monoxide levels inside homes became dangerous. In 1981, a 12-year-old boy named Todd Domboski fell into a sudden sinkhole that opened beneath his feet. He was pulled out in time, but the incident made national headlines. That same year, the US Congress allocated millions of dollars to relocate the town. The government offered buyouts to residents willing to leave. Some resisted, They formed community groups, argued that the danger was exaggerated, and questioned official studies. Others accepted the offer and moved. Houses were demolished gradually, not all at once. Over time, empty lots outnumbered homes. In 1992, Pennsylvania's governor invoked eminent domain. All property in Centralia was condemned. The zip code 17927 was officially retired. The US Postal Service stopped deliveries. The remaining residents were ordered to vacate. Though a few refused and engaged in legal battles, the town was officially deincorporated in 2002. As of 2024, fewer than 5 people are known to live in the area, under special agreements with the state. Modern maps no longer show Centralia as an active municipality. Some atlases label it as former site of Centralia or leave the space blank entirely. Navigation apps show roads with names but no addresses. The town has become a place of gaps where digital maps list streets without homes, intersections without destinations. A grid remains, but the town it once organized has disappeared. The fire has never been extinguished. It still burns today, moving slowly through coal seams that stretch for miles. The ground is unstable in parts. Methane and carbon monoxide vent from boreholes. Warning signs dot the landscape. The state maintains a perimeter around known hotspots, but the full extent of the fire remains uncertain. Estimates suggest it could continue for another 100 years. Cartographic removal was gradual. In the 1982nd, state highway maps began omitting Centralia's name. By the early 2002nd, most US Geological Survey maps had erased the town boundary. School district maps no longer included the area. Voting precincts were redrawn, utility grids were revised. In satellite imagery, patches of grey and green now cover where homes once stood. In many ways, Centralia is still visible. Tourists visit the remains. Spray-painted messages cover the cracked pavement of abandoned Route 61, once the town's main artery. Local graffiti artists dubbed it Graffiti Highway before it was covered with soil in 2020 to discourage trespassing. Before that, it had become a visual marker, an unofficial monument to a place still burning. But even with visitors and visual cues, the town does not exist formally. It cannot issue permits. It has no mayor, no council, no budget, no new construction is allowed. Former residents recall addresses that are no longer valid. Tax records for parcels in Centralia are held in county offices but flagged as inactive. GPS systems list names like Big Mine Run Road or Wood Street, but with no associated destinations. Historical societies have attempted to preserve Centralia's memory. Some have created overlays using archival maps, comparing the street layout from the 1952nd with current aerial images. These show the slow erasure, house by house, block by block. A few foundations remain, surrounded by trees and brush. Nature has returned. Deer roam streets once lined with porches and telephone poles. Unlike towns that vanished due to economic decline or war, Centralia was consumed by an invisible threat, one that left structures standing long after they were abandoned. The town died slowly, as smoke rose quietly between floorboards and garden beds. Erasure was administrative first, then physical, and finally cartographic. In many map databases today, Centralia is treated as a ghost town or historical place. The GNIS, Geographic Names Information System, retains a reference to Centralia, but with notes about its non-inhabited status. State-maintained maps of Columbia County identify the area only as part of an unorganized zone. There are no new census entries, no population estimate, no density metrics. Few other towns in the United States have undergone such a thorough and steady removal. Centralia's story is not simply about disaster, but about what happens when a town becomes too dangerous to remain on paper. In disaster planning maps, the area is often marked in red. but in general reference maps, it fades to grey or white, representing absence rather than danger. The physical signs remain for now. Concrete steps leading to empty lots. Street signs still attached to poles. A rusted playground partially buried in weeds. But each year more is removed, either by natural overgrowth or official dismantling. As buildings collapse, fewer visual anchors remain to tell travellers what once stood here. In the future, Centralia may disappear, even from memory. Already, some navigation systems reroute automatically around the area. Mobile apps show unnamed regions. For younger generations, it is a curiosity mentioned in online forums, often misunderstood or mythologized. Some mistake it for a hoax. Others associate it with fictional places inspired by it, such as the video game Silent Hill, which borrowed visual elements from Centralia's smoke-filled streets. But the town was real. It had addresses, families, parades, and newspapers. And now it does not. Cartographers removed Centralia not with a single stroke, but with edits made over decades, revised indexes, reclassified boundaries, withdrawn postal codes. It is still there in the minds of those who knew it, but on the map, it is no longer needed. The removed settlement of Kowloon Walled City, Hong Kong. Kowloon Walled City once stood as a dense, towering anomaly on the fringes of Hong Konga, place of contradictions, shadows, and survival. Nestled in the Kowloon City district, just north of the former Kai Tak Airport, the walled city defied every principle of urban planning. At its peak, over 30,000 people lived within a land area smaller than a city block. It was, by some measures, the most densely populated place on Earth. But today, it exists only in memory. Its name has been erased from maps, its labyrinth of corridors flattened, replaced by grass and concrete paths. For decades, the walled city was tolerated. Then it was removed. The site had been fortified since the 15th century, originally as a Chinese military outpost during the Song dynasty. Later, during the Qing dynasty, walls were added to protect against piracy and local unrest. When the British took control of the new territories in 1898, they allowed the Chinese to maintain the small walled enclave under a vague agreement. As colonial rule expanded, the city became a legal grey zonette, nickly Chinese, but surrounded by British-administered Hong Kong. Over time, that ambiguity gave rise to a place that fell between jurisdictions. During the Japanese occupation of Hong Kong in World War II, the city's walls were dismantled for construction materials. After the war, squatters moved in. By the 1950s, thousands of refugees from mainland China settled there, many fleeing civil war. With no clear government oversight, the walled city began to grow horizontally at first, then upward. Residents built new floors atop existing structures. Builders rarely used formal plans or permits. Electricity was tapped from nearby lines. Water came from rooftop tanks. Sewage ran in exposed pipes. By the 1960s and 1970s, Kowloon Walled City had become an enclosed megastructure and urban organism unto itself. The buildings were so tightly packed that sunlight could barely penetrate the inner alleys. Corridors measured less than 2 feet wide. Some staircases ended in walls. Ventilation was minimal. The city had 300 interconnected buildings rising up to 14 stories high, often with no foundations reaching bedrock. Inside, a complex network of clinics, unlicensed dentists, schools, shops, noodle stalls, and factories operated continuously. Because the city existed in a legal void, formal law enforcement was limited. In the 1950s and 1960s, the walled city became known for criminal activity, especially triad operations involving gambling and opium. Police rarely entered, and when they did, it was with caution. However, by the 1980s, crime had declined. Community organizations formed. Residents developed informal systems of order. Neighbors patrolled their own blocks. Children played in the narrow gaps between towers. People adapted to the vertical chaos. The walled city's population peaked at over 30,000 residents in the early 1980s, according to government estimates. That translated to over 3.2 million people per square mile, a density unmatched anywhere else. Each family lived in units averaging 23 square meters. The city functioned through improvisation. Electrical wiring crisscrossed the ceilings. Plumbing was built where it could fit. Small businesses thrived, producing food, textiles, toys, and plastic goods. On maps of Hong Kong from the 1960s and 70s, the walled city is shown as a blank space, labeled only by its outline. Some atlases used a shaded box with the annotation Walled City or Chinese Enclave. No street names were given, no internal divisions were marked. The city resisted measurement. Aerial photographs show a rectangular mass of grey concrete, unlike any other neighborhood in the territory. Official surveys of the interior were rare. The city had become an omission that could no longer be ignored. In the 1980s, as negotiations began over the return of Hong Kong to Chinese control, discussions about the walled city intensified. Both British and Chinese authorities agreed that the enclave could not continue. In 1987, the Hong Kong government announced plans to demolish it. Compensation packages were offered. The process was complex. Residents had to be counted, registered, and relocated. Some refused. Others had no formal title to the homes they lived in. Legal battles followed. Demolition began in 1993. It took nearly a year to dismantle the dense structure. Buildings were brought down carefully to avoid damaging surrounding properties. As the concrete fell, archaeologists documented remnants of the original Qing walls. A few foundation stones from the old military post were uncovered and preserved. Everything else, homes, businesses, alleyways, was removed. In 1995, the site was reopened as Kowloon Walled City Park. Landscaped gardens replaced apartment towers. Stone walkways trace the old city's perimeter. The park includes restored elements of the original Qing-era Yamen government office, as well as decorative archways and pavilions. Information plaques display photographs of the city before its removal. But the space is serene. Visitors stroll through bamboo groves. Birdsong replaces the hum of fluorescent lights. The map no longer shows a city. On modern maps of Hong Kong, there is no reference to Kowloon Walled City. The area is labeled simply as Kowloon Walled City Park. No building outlines are visible. Satellite imagery reveals trees, lawns, and tiled roofs. GPS systems navigate users to the park entrance, not to a neighborhood. What was once the most populated square in the world is now an open space. No postal addresses remain from the walled city. The internal grid of units had no standardized numbering. When people moved out, few took their addresses with them. Records are scattered, some in government archives, others in oral histories. Academic researchers have preserved architectural sketches, photographs, and personal testimonies. Museums in Hong Kong display models and recreations, but these are fragmented memories of a structure that resisted conventional design. Those who lived there often describe a sense of community. Despite the physical constraints, residents formed close bonds. Children wandered freely through the corridors. Vendors knew their customers. The city's reputation, outside its walls of danger and decay, was often at odds with the lived experience of its inhabitants. Photographs taken in the final years show small temples tucked between stairwells, dentists working in narrow offices, and elderly residents sitting beside balconies only a meter wide. International media took interest during the 1980s and 90s. Documentaries captured the final years. Journalists described the city as a human ant colony, a vertical slum, an architectural curiosity. But, as demolition progressed, coverage faded. The maps were updated. The anomaly was closed. Kowloon Walled City is now the subject of academic studies in architecture, sociology, and urban planning. Its absence is analyzed as much as its structure. How could a city so large, so complex, and so populated be removed so completely? The answer lies in governance, intent, and the soft erasure of space. When authorities agree to dismantle and reclassify a space, cartographic memory follows suit. The walled city no longer appears in district planning documents. Property records show a continuous green space. Search engines return images of gardens, not alleyways. In most representations, the city is gone. But among former residents, the memory persists. Reunions are held occasionally. Photographs are shared. Researchers maintain oral history projects to preserve first-hand accounts. Yet for those who come later visitors to the park, students reading textbooks, the walled city is a concept, not a place. The narrow bridges, the rooftop tanks, the corridor markets all were real. But now they exist only in archives and recollection. In this way, the Kowloon Walled City was not just demolished, it was erased. The deleted island of New Moor, South Taupati, Bay of Bengal. In the northern reaches of the Bay of Bengal, where the mouths of the Ganges and Brahmaputra rivers empty into the sea, a small patch of land surfaced unexpectedly in the aftermath of a cyclone. It was the early 1970s. Local fishermen from both India and Bangladesh began reporting the appearance of a new island near the mouth of the Haryabanga River, a distributary that serves as a boundary between the two countries. The island had not been there before. It was flat, sandy, uninhabited, and measured just a few square kilometers. But despite its humble size, it triggered decades of diplomatic tension. Each country gave it a name. India called it New Moor Island, while Bangladesh referred to it as South Taupati. Then, just as quietly as it had arrived, the island disappeared, erased not by politics, but by water. The island first drew international attention following the 1971 Bangladesh Liberation War. When the newly independent Bangladesh emerged from conflict, its borders were still being formalized. Satellite imagery taken shortly after the war showed a small landmass had formed on the Bangladeshi side of the maritime boundary, or so it seemed. The island's location made it strategically important not for its land, which was uninhabitable, but for the potential extension it offered to each country's maritime claims. Under international law, territorial seas and exclusive economic zones, EEZs, are calculated from land features. Even a sandbar can influence claims to offshore oil, gas, and fishing rights. India quickly raised a flag and stationed border security force personnel on New Moor Island. Bangladesh issued formal objections, stating that the island belonged to them based on proximity to the coast and the main flow of the Haryabanga River. What followed was not open conflict, but a prolonged diplomatic stalemate. No shots were fired, no formal negotiations concluded the matter, but both sides maintained their positions for nearly 4 decades. Maps printed in India in the 1980s and 1990s sometimes included the island, labeled as New Moor and colored with Indian territory. Bangladeshi maps used the name South Talpati, shaded with national color and presented as part of the southwestern Khulna division. International nautical charts often avoided choosing sides, marking the island without national designation or noting its disputed status. The island appeared in maritime law journals, boundary commission reports, and hydrological studies of the Ganges Delta. But no civilians lived there. It had no fresh water. During high tides, parts of it were submerged, and the sea around it remained turbulent and unstable. The very forces that had brought the island into being, cyclonic activity, shifting sediment, and seasonal flooding, were still active. The deltaic environment of the Bay of Bengal is one of the most dynamic coastal systems on Earth. New islands form and erode within years. Shorelines retreat and advance unpredictably. Sandbars drift. In this context, New Moor, South Talpati, was always geologically precarious. In 2010, satellite images captured by NASA revealed a change. The island's outline had faded. Tidal activity appeared to be washing away its surface. By the end of that year, researchers from the School of Oceanographic Studies in Kolkata confirmed what the images had suggested: New Moor Island had vanished beneath the waves. It had eroded completely, leaving behind no dry land at low tide. Where once stood a contested island, there was now open sea. The announcement received brief coverage in regional media. Indian scientists noted that the island had been losing elevation for years. Rising sea levels due to climate change and natural coastal erosion had contributed to its disappearance. Bangladesh, too, acknowledged the island's loss, but pointed to the broader issue of vanishing land in the delta, where entire coastal communities face similar threats. What might have been a moment of diplomatic resolution instead passed quietly, dissolved by geography. Following the island's disappearance, both governments removed it from official maps. Indian cartographic agencies no longer shaded the area as national territory. Bangladeshi hydrographic offices updated their charts, deleting the South Talpati label. International maritime charts issued in the 2010s marked the area as shallow water, with notes on sediment drift. The landmass was gone, only its history remained. The case of New Moor, South Talpati, is unusual. Most territorial disputes end through treaties, wars, or arbitration. Here, nature rendered the issue moot. No legal agreement was signed. No formal declaration made. The ocean removed the problem. Yet the erasure had real consequences. Without a landmass to anchor claims, maritime boundary negotiations became more complex. In 2014, the Permanent Court of Arbitration at The Hague issued a ruling on the maritime boundary between India and Bangladesh. The decision awarded Bangladesh nearly 19,000 square kilometers of the disputed sea zone. The court acknowledged that the absence of New Moor, South Talpati, simplified the delimitation process. The island no longer needed to be factored into the equation. Today, the coordinates once assigned to the island point to open water. Navigation systems mark the area as part of the Bay of Bengal. No shipping routes pass directly over it. Fishing boats may cross the area, but no buoys, markers, or flags remain. Satellite images show only ripple waves moving over a shifting seabed. In archival maps and academic databases, the island still exists as a reference point. Historical timelines of India-Bangladesh relations include its appearance and disappearance. It features in climate change case studies, highlighting how fragile low-lying landforms can be. For coastal engineers, it is an example of how legal boundaries intersect with impermanent geography. But for most people, Newmore Island is forgotten. It was never settled, never developed, and never visited except by security personnel or scientific teams. It had no buildings, no names carved into stones, no artifacts. Its existence was bureaucratic, strategic, and abstract, important for what it could grant, not for what it contained. The erasure of Newmore was not just physical, it was administrative. Agencies updated digital records, map publishers revised templates, educational materials stopped mentioning it. In a world increasingly defined by data points and coordinates, the island slipped between updates. Few people noticed its absence. Fewer still remember its presence. Environmental scientists warn that such erasures will become more common. As sea levels rise and weather patterns intensify, the world's coastlines will continue to shift, islands will form and vanish. Disputes may become irrelevant, not through diplomacy, but through submergence. Newmore was the beginning, not the end of that trend. In Bangladesh, over 70 square kilometers of land are lost annually to river erosion. In India's Sundarbans, entire villages have been abandoned due to saline intrusion and rising tides. Newmore's disappearance is a local story with global implications. It challenges the assumption that land is fixed, that boundaries are permanent, and that territory is a matter of lines drawn in ink. On older nautical charts, a tiny shape sits at the northern edge of the Bay of Bengal, sometimes labeled, sometimes not. It is a faint echo of a claim, a dispute, and a shoreline that never held still. In newer charts, the space is empty. The island that once raised flags now raises questions. The silent removal of Lake Peigneur, Louisiana. In Iberia Parish, Louisiana, there was once a shallow freshwater lake called Lake Peigneur. Just 10 feet deep at its center, it sat quietly at the edge of Jefferson Island, surrounded by swampland and live oaks draped in moss. Local fishermen knew its tides, which were gentle and predictable. The lake had no natural outlet, and its waters barely stirred. But on the morning of November 20th, 1980, something happened beneath the lakebed that would not only reverse the flow of a canal, it would erase the lake's shape from maps, change its depth forever, and nearly erase a drilling crew from existence. It began with a miscalculation. A Texaco oil rig was conducting exploratory drilling on the lake's surface. The rig's crew was attempting to tap into the subterranean salt domes beneath the area, large, dome-shaped geological formations composed of solid salt, which are often used to store gas or extract minerals. But the drill punctured the ceiling of a salt mine operated by Diamond Crystal Salt Company directly beneath the lake. The hole, only a few inches wide at first, breached the roof of one of the mine's upper chambers. Water from the lake poured in. Within minutes, a whirlpool formed on the surface of Lake Peigneur. It grew rapidly, pulling down the drilling platform, trees, and entire acres of shoreline. 11 barges were docked nearby. They were swallowed one by one. A tugboat disappeared into the spinning water. The lake, once calm and shallow, became an open drain. Below, over 50 miners were working in the salt caverns. When the breach occurred, their tunnels began to flood. Miraculously, all of them escaped through side shafts and secondary exits. There were no deaths. But the mine was destroyed. As more water flowed into the void, the size of the whirlpool increased. The force of the suction reversed the flow of the Delcambra Canal, which normally carried water from the lake to the Gulf of Mexico. For several hours, salty Gulf water flowed upstream into Lake Peigneur. It was the only time in recorded history that the direction of that canal reversed due to natural or rather unnatural forces. By the end of the day, the lakebed had been transformed into a crater. A sinkhole more than 1,300 feet wide had formed. The once shallow freshwater lake now had a depth of over 200 feet and a salinity level more consistent with a coastal inlet. It had connected permanently with the ocean. Cartographers were left with a dilemma. The shape, depth, and ecological character of Lake Peigneur had changed overnight. Previously drawn as a minor inland lake with a smooth contour and freshwater attributes, it now needed to be reclassified. For several years, maps continued to show the original outline, but survey data, satellite imagery, and bathymetric readings revealed a different geography. The water level had risen, the shoreline had shifted. The Central Depression was now the deepest lake in Louisiana. Geological records were rewritten. Hydrological charts revised their flow vectors. Navigation maps updated the canal's behavior, but few outside the region understood the full scale of what had occurred. The event was documented, reported, and studied, but in terms of national cartographic memory, it was quietly edited. The U.S. Geological Survey resurveyed the area in 1981. The new data showed a complete change in the lake's bathymetry. State-level topographic maps gradually replaced the pre-1980 shape with new outlines, though older versions remained in circulation for years. Educational materials rarely acknowledged the transformation. It was not a disappearance in the traditional sense but an erasure of a lake's previous form, overwritten by an accident. In subsequent years, vegetation regrew around the altered shoreline. Some of the barges that had been swallowed were later recovered when they surfaced, bizarrely, in a nearby canal. The tugboat that had gone under rose days later, largely intact. The drilling platform was never found. The salt mine was permanently closed and sealed. Despite the magnitude of the disaster, few physical markers were left behind. A small sign near Jefferson Island notes the date and mentions the event as a local oddity. But visitors to the lake today see calm water, ringed by cypress trees and modest homes. The new depth is not visible from the surface. The reversal of the canal, once an engineering marvel, is not commemorated. The event was declared an industrial accident. Legal settlements were reached. Texaco paid damages. No criminal charges were filed. Lake Peigneur's transformation is a rare case of environmental geography being altered in a matter of hours. Most changes to landscape and water systems happen gradually through erosion, tectonics, or climate shifts. But here, an entire subterranean structure collapsed, and a lake changed character overnight. Its erasure was not of location, but of identity. Old maps show Lake Peigneur with soft curves, labeled with standard blue shading. New maps render it differently. The depth readings are steeper. The shape, more angular. In satellite imagery, sediment lines indicate the shift. Some aerial photos show the outline of the sinkhole as a slightly darker hue, the only visible reminder of the event. Digital mapping platforms reflect the updated contours but make no note of the change. Search engines return standard information about the lake's current depth and size. There is no marker or note indicating that the lake was once 10 feet deep and filled with fresh water. The erasure is silent, technical, and complete. The disappearance of the original Lake Penure is not considered a mystery. There is no conspiracy, no unresolved questions, but it serves as an example of how quickly geography can shift and how easily those shifts can be absorbed by cartography. When the lake changed, so did the map. The old shape, the old flow, the old labels quietly discarded. Hydrologists studying Louisiana's inland waters now list Penure as a unique Cassia saline lake connected to the Gulf, formed by a mining accident. Its hydrological category has changed. Its depth tables reflect new measurements. Its soil chemistry no longer supports the same flora it once did. All of these changes are documented, but they exist primarily in technical literature, not in public awareness. Residents around the lake today rarely speak of the event unless prompted. Many have moved away. The area has stabilized, and no further collapses have occurred. But beneath the still water, the old mine remains flooded, and the landscape, both above and below, has been permanently altered. There is no monument for what was lost, no museum display, no formal commemoration of the map that once showed a quiet freshwater lake near Delcambra. Only a new map, a new outline, and a depth that wasn't there before. The ghost village of Imber, England. In the rolling hills of Wiltshire, nestled within the vast military training grounds of Salisbury Plain, there once stood a quiet English village named Imber. For centuries, it existed as a modest agricultural settlement. Remote, traditional, and largely self-sufficient, Imber's name appeared on maps, census rolls, and parish registers. Its residents lived in stone cottages, farmed the chalk-rich soil, and gathered at the small parish church of St. Giles. Then, in 1943, during the height of the Second World War, the British War Office issued an eviction notice. Soldiers arrived, families packed their belongings, and the village of Imber was abandoned in just over a month. The story begins much earlier. The area around Imber had been inhabited for millennia. Prehistoric burial mounds and Iron Age earthworks dot the nearby hills. The Domesday Book of 1086 recorded Imber as a settlement of modest size, with ploughlands, meadows, and woodlands. Through the medieval period, it remained a rural parish. By the early 20th century, Imber consisted of roughly 50 building stone houses, a manor farm, a school, a blacksmith's shop, and a pub known as the Bell. Its population hovered between 150 and 200 residents. Though remote, Imber was no secret. Ordnance Survey maps from the early 1900s show the village clearly. Its roads connected to nearby towns like Warminster and Tilshead. Parish boundaries were outlined. The Church of St. Giles was marked with a cross symbol, surrounded by farm fields and footpaths. To the casual reader of maps, Imber appeared as any other small English village, estable, continuous, and permanent. In the late 19th century, the War Office had begun acquiring parcels of land across Salisbury Plain. Its chalk grasslands and sparse population made the area suitable for artillery training. Over time, military ownership increased, though the villages of Imber remained on privately held land. By the 1930s, the army owned much of the surrounding area, but still permitted farming and tenancy to continue. That changed in 1943. With preparations for the Allied invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe underway, the British military identified Imber as an ideal training site for urban warfare. Its clustered houses, narrow lanes, and isolation made it a perfect stand-in for a continental village. In November, all residents received formal notice to leave. The eviction order gave them until mid-December. Many believed the move was temporary. Some accepted the decision reluctantly, believing patriotic duty required sacrifice. Others were devastated. Families who had lived in the village for generations were forced to leave behind their homes, land, and community. Compensation was offered, but ownership was complex. Many villagers were tenants, not freeholders. Livestock was sold off, furniture was left in place, graves in the churchyard were abandoned. By Christmas of 1943, Imber was empty, and the army had moved in. During and after the war, the village was used for military training. Live fire exercises were conducted in surrounding areas. Urban warfare drills took place inside the buildings. The army built additional structures, mock houses with flat roofs, made of brick and concrete designed to simulate European streets. Imber's original buildings, especially those with historical features, were avoided during shelling, but the damage from time, weather, and minor incidents accumulated. Most roofs collapsed over the next few decades. After the war ended in 1945, former residents began petitioning for the right to return. Many had believed the evacuation was temporary. They wrote letters to members of parliament. Public meetings were held. The War Office insisted the area was still essential for training. No return was allowed. In the 1960s, a legal challenge was mounted. Former villagers argued that the government had reneged on its promise. The courts ruled in favor of the Ministry of Defense. The land, now owned outright by the Crown, would remain closed. Imber would remain under military control. Maps began to reflect this change. In Ordnance Survey maps from the 1950s and 60s, the village of Imber is marked with parentheses Imbira notation, indicating limited or conditional access. Some editions used grey text, others added warning symbols for restricted areas. By the 1970s, most civilian road atlases had removed the village altogether. Where Imber once appeared, the space was blank, or labelled simply as Salisbury Plain Training Area. Road names disappeared. Footpaths were closed. The church remained labelled in some editions, but as a structure without connection to a village. Despite its removal from public maps, Imber remained physically intact, at least partially. St. Giles Church, a 13th century building with a square tower and Victorian-era restoration, was spared from demolition. The church's conservation trust took over its care. Services were held there once a year, on the Feast of St. Giles in early September. Later, access was expanded slightly. Today, the church is open to the public on a few designated weekends each year. When the Ministry of Defense suspends training and allows supervised entry, the rest of the village is a shell. Houses stand roofless. Windows are bricked. Doors are sealed with sheet metal. In the 1980s and 90s, some original homes were replaced with training facades, windowless boxes made from concrete block. These structures are used to simulate modern warfare environments. Streets remain unpaved. Signs warn of unexploded ordnance. Entry outside official open days is prohibited. Satellite images reveal the layout. A network of roads, Imber Court Road, Church Street, East Street, still exists in form, though not in use. Some alignments are clear, others are covered in brush. The school is gone. The pub is gone. Only the church and a few semi-ruined farm buildings offer clues to the village's former life. Visitors who attend the open days describe the atmosphere as quiet and unsettling. The walk from the perimeter checkpoint to the church passes buildings with faded paint and rusting hinges. Occasionally, military vehicles sit parked nearby, awaiting the next training rotation. Inside the church, wooden pews remain. Candles are lit during services. A war memorial lists the names of men from Imber who died in World War I. Their descendants, now living elsewhere, still return to pay respects. Some efforts have been made to preserve Imber's memory. Oral history projects have recorded testimonies from former residents. Local history groups have compiled photographs, letters, and family trees. Exhibits at nearby museums include artifacts, farm tools, books, school registers rescued before the buildings collapsed. But these materials are scattered. There is no centralized archive, no permanent exhibit. Digital maps today treat Imber with ambiguity. Some navigation apps show the location only when zoomed in closely. Others omit it entirely. GPS directions to St. Giles Church are only available during access weekends. The postal code, once associated with the village, has been retired. Electoral registers list no voters. Census data shows the parish as uninhabited. In cartographic databases, Imber exists, but faintly its data tagged with restriction codes and zero values. Despite repeated petitions, the Ministry of Defense has not changed its stance. Imber remains an active training area. Its streets are walked more often by soldiers than by civilians. No new construction is allowed except for military simulation purposes. Restoration of buildings is minimal. Only the church is protected by legal designation. Among Britain's abandoned villages, Imber is uniquely preserved not by intention, but by limitation. Its erasure is administrative, legal, and spatial. The buildings stand, but their function is void. The map retains a trace, but the path to the village is closed. Some have called for Imber to be returned, or at least memorialized more formally. Others accept its fate as sealed. For now, the village remains in suspended animation, part ruin, part training ground, part memory. It is a village you cannot move to, cannot drive through, and cannot see without permission. It is a place erased without being destroyed. The submerged capital of Old Adaminaby, Australia. In the southeastern highlands of New South Wales, nestled in the Monaro region, there once stood a rural town called Adaminaby. It was a modest place, a collection of cottages, stores, stockyards, and wide, dusty streets, surrounded by rolling grasslands and snow-fed rivers. The town served local graziers and travellers moving between the snowy mountains and Canberra. But in the 1950s, Adaminaby was removed not by war, erosion, or neglect, but by water. It was not erased by accident, but by design. At the time, Australia was entering a period of industrial and national transformation. The country needed electricity, and the snowy mountains held the potential for one of the most ambitious hydroelectric and irrigation schemes in the world. The Snowy Mountains Hydroelectric Scheme, officially launched in 1949, was a vast infrastructure project intended to redirect water from the Snowy River westward into the Murray and Murrumbidgee River systems. This would support farming in the dry interior while generating hydroelectric power for growing cities. But the engineering feat came with human cost. The construction of Lake Yucumbene, one of the project's largest reservoirs, required the flooding of the Yukonbean River Valley. This valley was home to old Adaminaby. Surveys showed that the rising water level would eventually submerge the entire town. The government determined that Adaminaby would have to be relocated. The decision was final. Beginning in 1956, an extraordinary operation commenced. Buildings were marked, photographed, and assessed. Some were dismantled and moved piece by piece. Others were loaded onto sleds and hauled up the valley by trucks and tractors. Wooden cottages, churches, and shops were relocated to a new site several kilometers to the northwest. In total, more than 100 structures were physically moved. Roads were rebuilt, foundations were repoured. A new town was constructed on higher ground, modern, planned, and dry. Yet not everything was saved. Many buildings, too old or fragile, were left behind. These included sheds, fences, and stone walls. Graveyards were exhumed. Some families chose to leave. Farms along the river were abandoned. Fields vanished beneath the waterline. When the dam was completed and the valley began to fill, old Adaminaby disappeared beneath the surface. The process took months, but by 1958, the reservoir had reached its full level. The lake covered not only the town, but also bridges, trees, and roads. At maximum capacity, Lake Yukonbean holds nearly 4.8 billion cubic meters of water. The former town site now lies beneath tens of meters of lake water. It is invisible to the casual observer. Boaters crossing the reservoir see only waves and distant hills. The water hides the outlines of once familiar streets, buried foundations, and the remnants of a town that was once the heart of the valley. On maps printed before the 1950s, Adaminaby appears as a dot along the Yukonbean River at a bend in the road leading toward Kiandra and Kuma. Topographic maps show contour lines, roads, and the original township's grid. But by the 1960s, maps had been redrawn. The new town was labeled simply as Adaminaby, and the old location was submerged beneath the artificial lake. Some historical atlases included footnotes site of former Adaminaby, now under Lake Yukonbean, but most modern maps omit the original altogether. A few digital mapping services still mark the old location with a label such as Old Adaminaby Submerged, though no navigation routes are possible. Satellite imagery shows the blue-gray expanse of the reservoir, with no signs of habitation. The coordinates remain, but the place is gone. Occasionally, during severe droughts, the lake recedes. When the water level drops far enough, the remnants of old Adaminaby begin to reappear. Stone ruins emerge from the mud chimneys. House foundations, fence posts, paved roads reappear briefly, stretching across the cracked lake bed. These sightings are fleeting. Within weeks, the water often rises again, reclaiming the structures. Locals sometimes travel to the shoreline during these low periods to walk among the ruins. Photographs are taken, memories shared. Former residents or their descendants point to where the school once stood, or the town hall, or the general store. For them, the re-emergence is a rare connection to a past hidden beneath the water most of the year. The relocation of Adaminaby was, by many measures, a success. The new town prospered, it attracted tourism, and became a center for trout fishing. It is best known today for its giant trout statue, a roadside monument standing over 10 meters tall. Yet the original town, the one with dirt roads and timber yards, with cottages clustered along the river, is a different story. It survives only in memory, in fading photographs, and in the occasional dry season. There was no disaster, no violence, no sudden loss. Yet the removal of old Adaminaby was total. It was managed through plans, surveys, trucks, and dynamite. It was accompanied by official speeches, engineering diagrams, and compensation forms. But the final result was the same. A town erased from everyday maps, its identity submerged. For cartographers, the transition posed challenges. They had to update road alignments, hydrological features, elevation profiles, and settlement markers. Historical layers were archived. Modern layers replaced them. The map, which once showed a settlement beside a river, now showed a lake with no visible history beneath. Only the most detailed hydrographic charts included reference points for the old town site. Environmental scientists sometimes study the site using sonar and ground-penetrating radar. Underwater archaeology in Lake Ucumbini is limited, but a few surveys have recorded structures still standing, preserved by the cold, oxygen-poor water. Rooflines collapsed, chimneys tilted. Metal remains of farm equipment rest on the lakebed. But these records remain mostly unpublished technical data held in archives, not part of public history. Australian school books seldom mention old Adaminaby. The relocation is noted as part of the Snowy scheme, but the town's disappearance is usually treated as a footnote. There is no national memorial, no museum exhibition. At the lakeside, a modest plaque acknowledges the relocation. It names the families and marks the water's edge, but says little else. Visitors read it in passing, often unaware they are standing where streets once met. Local historical societies maintain more detailed records. Oral histories, family documents, and rare film footage are preserved in community centers and libraries. A few have returned to the new Adaminaby, living on high ground, looking down over the reservoir. Others moved far away, their connection to the valley buried along with the town. Today, old Adaminaby is a blank on the map. It is not included in address databases. It has no census data. It does not receive mail, phone lines, or foot traffic. Its location is part of a reservoir that continues to serve the nation's energy grid. But beneath the surface, the outlines of a town remain. Fences, hearthstones, footpaths still present but unseen. For some, the flooding of the town was a necessary sacrifice for progress. For others, it is a quiet loss, marked not by ruins but by absence. The map changed, and the name moved. But the place itself, its stories, structures, and soul remains underwater. It is still there, just not where you can see it. The missing town of Kennecott, Alaska. High in the Wrangell Mountains of southeastern Alaska, a cluster of weathered red buildings clings to a steep slope overlooking the Kennecott Glacier. Once a thriving mining town, Kennecott was one of the richest copper-producing sites in the United States. Between 1911 and 1938, it exported millions of dollars worth of copper ore. Trains ran daily. Miners worked in shifts around the clock. There were bunkhouses, a hospital, a schoolhouse, a general store, and a power plant. But by the early 1940s, the buildings were empty. The ore was gone. And Kennecott faded not through disaster or destruction, but through quiet abandonment. The name disappeared from most modern maps, replaced only by faint traces and mislabels. The town still stands, but for decades it was treated as though it didn't. Kennecott was born out of geological chance. In 1900, two prospectors, Jack Smith and Clarence Warner, discovered a green-stained ridge of high-grade copper ore in the mountains near the Kennecott Glacier. Their find triggered a flurry of interest from investors, including J.P. Morgan and the Guggenheim family. They formed the Kennecott Copper Corporation and began development. A 196-mile railroad was constructed through rugged wilderness to connect the mine with the port town of Cordova. It took 5 years, thousands of workers, and immense capital to complete. By 1911, the Kennecott mine was fully operational. Workers extracted copper from 5 different mines: Bonanza, Jumbo, Mother Lode, Erie, and Glacier. Ore was hauled by aerial tramways from the mountains down to the mill building in the valley below. The mill itself, now a rust-colored wooden structure standing 14 stories high, was the centerpiece of the town. Inside, crushing machines, conveyor belts, and flotation systems processed raw rock into high-purity copper concentrate. The town of Kennecott, spelled with an E to differentiate it from the nearby glacier, which retains the original spelling Kennecott, was purpose-built for efficiency. Housing for single men was simple and barrack style. Families lived in small cottages. There was a school, a recreation hall, and a hospital. Electricity was available 24 hours a day, rare even in much of urban Alaska at the time. Trains arrived with food, mail, and passengers, and left loaded with copper bound for global markets. At its peak, the town supported over 300 people, and the region accounted for over $200 million in copper profits by today's standards. But like many extraction-based towns, Kennecott had a fixed lifespan. The copper veins began to run dry in the 1930s. One by one, the mines were shut down. The Great Depression hastened the decline. In 1938, with no profitable ore left to extract, the Kennecott Copper Corporation shut down operations entirely. When the last train departed, most of the town's residents left with it. The company left behind equipment, buildings, and even furniture. Maps continued to list Kennecott into the early 1940s, but as the town was no longer inhabited, it began to disappear from atlases and navigation charts. By the 1950s, most road maps no longer marked the location. The rail line fell into disrepair and was eventually removed. Trails leading to the town were overgrown. Only the name persisted faintly, usually misspelled or confused with the nearby glacier. For nearly 40 years, Kennecott stood in silence. The buildings remained, battered by wind and snow. The wooden mill structure, enormous and skeletal, loomed over the valley. In the 1970s, backcountry hikers began rediscovering the town. Photographers and history enthusiasts visited, documenting the decaying architecture. But still, the town did not return to maps. It was labeled only as abandoned mining site or omitted entirely. Tourists needed to rely on local knowledge to find it. It wasn't until the 1980s that Kennecott re-entered official records. In 1986, the area was designated a National Historic Landmark. The National Park Service acquired most of the site, including the mill, tramways, and several buildings. The land became part of Wrangell St. Elias National Park and Preserve, the largest national park in the United States. Restoration efforts began. Stabilization crews repaired roofs, replaced collapsed walls, and documented machinery left in place since the 1930s. Despite its protected status, Kennecott remained off the radar of many cartographers. Digital maps continued to mark the general area as remote wilderness. Few included a precise label for the town. GPS systems often misplace it. Road signage in nearby McCarthy, the closest community, gives directions, but most visitors still rely on physical trail maps or park guides to find their way. The road to Kennecott built atop the old railroad bed is narrow, winding, and often impassable in winter. Visitors cross a footbridge near McCarthy and travel several miles by shuttle or foot to reach the town. The experience is immersive. Red buildings rise from the valley floor, perched against the white backdrop of the glacier. Wooden stairs climb the steep slope of the mill. Broken windows peer into rooms filled with rusted tools and century-old pulleys. It feels preserved in time. Today, Kennecott is slowly returning to maps. The National Park Service maintains signage and visitor information. Some map publishers have reintroduced its name into digital and printed editions, though inconsistently. Some apps list it as historic site, others as Kennecott Mines. Navigation systems sometimes route to the glacier instead, leading visitors to the wrong side of the valley. The spelling difference continues to cause confusion. There is no permanent population. A handful of seasonal staff live nearby in summer. The town has no school, post office, or commercial center. But during peak months, thousands of visitors arrive to walk the mill, hike the trails, and photograph the preserved mining town that once disappeared from view. In cartographic terms, Kennecott was never formally erased, just quietly dropped. Its economic functions ceased, its residents left. No services remained to anchor it in administrative records. The map, reflecting those criteria, let it fade. Only when a new function, heritage, tourism, education was attached, did it begin to reappear. The physical layout of the town remains remarkably intact. The mill still stands, though some sections lean at precarious angles. A hospital building, dry house, bunkhouse, and power plant line the dirt paths. Signs mark where the general store once stood. A few original rail ties remain embedded in the ground. The surrounding wilderness has closed in, but the town's grid is visible. Those who visit Kennecott today walk through more than buildings. They traverse a gap in Mapinga town that fell from the page, then returned, not as a place to live, but as a plow. Remember, it is a rare example of a town fully abandoned, left untouched, and then revived as a preserved absence. The map no longer guides people to copper. It leads them to a story. Places may vanish from maps, but their traces remain in photographs, in foundations, in memories held by those who once called them home. Each erasure leaves behind a quiet outline, a negative space where roads once turned and windows once looked out. These towns, islands, and borders did not simply disappear, they were removed, redrawn, or redefined by time, policy, or nature. And though the maps have changed, the stories have not. If you've found meaning in these forgotten geographies, consider subscribing for more explorations into the hidden corners of history and the places the world left behind. Join us again as we uncover what lies just beyond the edge of the known.